And this is Bree Boskov, Master of Wine.
Stuck.
Ah, shoot. Recently married. It's force of habit. Congratulations. Master of Wine, working for the Oregon Wine Board. Also makes a little bit of wine herself, which you...
Wee bit.
A wee bit, which I'll taste today. And we've done this tour around quite a bit, actually.
Yeah.
LA, Toronto. We have a killer lineup of wines for you today. I think it will, some of them will surprise you in terms of either variety or vintage. And we have a little presentation for you as well.
Yeah, today we're excited because we're actually exclusively focusing on the Willamette Valley today, and we have really tapped into some of our iconic producers' cellars to show you some wines that might surprise you either by vintage or by variety. So you should learn a little about vintages and also a little about what's coming up in the Willamette Valley as well. So our first flight today is going to be focused on the whites and ending in a little Gamay Noir. Chardonnay, definitely a rising variety in the Willamette Valley. I know you're expecting Pinot Gris, but we'll have a Pinot Gris pop up outside in a little bit. Chardonnay is really what's exciting us and our winemakers at the moment. So we'll get into that in just a second. And then we're followed by Willamette Valley Pinot Noir from 2011. So a sort of vintage that has been dubbed a very cool vintage and lightly bagged by the critics. And these wines are often wines that need some time in bottle, and they are absolutely singing today, so you're in for a real treat. And then 2015, the polar opposite, a very warm vintage, and trending to what we've been seeing since 2014, essentially, in the Willamette Valley. And then the final flight is just a pair of wines, which we're calling the futurists of what might become in some of the newer plantings in the Willamette Valley. Just to get you oriented, we are on the West Coast. We are situated right above, I can't get this out there, right above California and just below Washington. As you can see from here, we sit between the 42nd and 46th northern latitudes, and we are on the western side of the Cascade Ranges. We are buffered a little bit by the Coast Range from the Pacific Ocean, but we are still a maritime climate, so just setting the scene there for you.
And to give you an idea of latitude, if you just go back real quickly, Bree.
I don't know how to go back. There we go.
The red button.
I got it. We're back.
Okay. So Santa Barbara down here would be at like 34 degrees of latitude. So in the grand scheme of things in the U.S., we're actually pretty far north here, which equates to more lights, et cetera, et cetera. So more
and
social.
Also explains the predominance of the Pinot Noir grape in terms of our red grape varieties as well, being so far north and so close to that cool Pacific Ocean influence. We are a growing region. We have 19 AVAs and increasing. We now have 7 within the northern Willamette Valley, and this will also increase in a number of years as well. And today we're going to be focused on the northern Willamette Valley for the wines in the glasses in front of us. So the Willamette Valley was established as an AVA in 1983. It's quite a large AVA, as you can see. It actually spreads from Portland. I can't get around
It's
that.
not going to work on the TV, I think.
Portland, right up buffering Washington on the Columbia River there.
I'll be your Vanna White.
Thank you, Vanna, lovely. And spreads all the way down to Eugene in the south there. So a 3.5 million acre AVA with a lot of land that's still unplanted. So obviously we're receiving a lot of interest from French and California producers who are really looking to the north in these changing times. And we're set to grow even more than what we have in the past decade. So you're going to see a lot more wine coming out of Oregon. At the moment, we make up for about 1% of US wine production. Tiny.
The total of Oregon, not just Willamette Valley, okay? And as you see, there's a lot of sub-AVAs in the north here, and that's where a lot of the wines most of the production is happening, and that's because that's where the original vines are planted in Dundee here, right smack dab in the middle. So all of this here, there's tons and tons of opportunity for diversity of varieties, because as you head further south, you're going to be a bit warmer, obviously, and there are different influences from both the coastal and Cascade ranges.
So down to Eugene, yeah, we're starting to get into different microclimates down here and slightly more opulent, fleshier styles, but it really depends on microclimate within these valley areas. So a lot of exciting land to still explore south of the North Willamette Valley. And the North Willamette Valley, we have 7 nested AVAs, with the newest being the Duzer Corridor, which I will let Chris speak about shortly. But really, these AVAs were brought into existence from 2004 onwards, and they are based on 200 feet elevation and above. Some vineyard plantings in the Chehalem Mountains and Parrot Mountain area especially are sitting at around 1,000 feet elevation. And this is where we're starting to see some increased plantings of cooler climate styles. So more of the Dijon varieties of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir at these higher elevations, taking advantage of the aspect and elevation and ocean influence that then comes in.
And while we're zoomed in here, just to give you a kind of idea of what the Willamette Valley was delineated as, we have the markers that were used for it. We have the Columbia River to the north, which actually acts as the natural boundary between Washington and Oregon. You have the influence of the Willamette River, which runs north and south, and then again the Cascade Range and the Coastal Range, along with the various kind of watersheds within this, and also forests that are here as well. So that's kind of how the line was drawn for the Willamette Valley in terms of influence of all of those things combined to create the identity of the Willamette Valley.
Vineyard plantings, the dominant variety is Pinot Noir at 67% of plantings. It is Oregon's largest AVA, and as I mentioned, 3.5 million acres and 23,000 acres planted. So still a lot of land that continue to be planted depending on aspect and elevation and regional boundaries. The north is becoming very heavily planted. You know, you're rare to find available planted land in, say, the Dundee Hills, but to the south and the expanding AVAs, Van Duzer AVA, Eola Amity, there's still a lot of plantable area that can really increase and make some great wines we're seeing.
And because the original vines that were planted in this region by David Lett in 1965 were Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, which really saw a lot of success both with national but more importantly with international tastings during the 70s, those are the varieties that really took off. So they compose the bulk of the plantings now, but we see all of these other varieties becoming more and more important in the grand scheme of things. This Syrah, for instance, is the first year that it made it on the board in terms of plantable acres. Also, this Chardonnay number is growing significantly because a lot of people are grafting over other vines, namely Pinot Gris for the most part, onto Chardonnay, because that's what people are really excited about right now. So while these numbers are mostly accurate, there are some elements that are changing and evolving here, which is exciting to see. And then we have, of course, this other category, which we're going to taste some of today, like amazing Gamay, Cabernet Franc, et cetera, et cetera.
So the geographical landmarks of Oregon, as Chris already mentioned, we've got the Coast Range on the west, Cascades to the east, act as that buffering effect from hot easterly winds that blow through the region in summer, which can desiccate fruit at times if you're at the end of the season in that critical ripening period. So those Cascade ranges really serve as a buffer from all of that hot central continental weather coming through. And then the Coast Range, we still are a maritime climate. We still have our seasons ended by the storms that come in off the cool Pacific Ocean. So we're always watching that weather right at the end of harvest there. And the influence of the fog and the cooling afternoon winds, which you can almost time your watch to in the northern Willamette to be about 2:30 in the afternoon. You start getting the funneling coming through of that internal continental heating up creating a vacuum that brings in the coastal influence, and it really channels down through all of these little tiny rangers in the Coast Range and creates that airflow and movement through the vineyards, which is so important to the freshness and the integrity of the fruit and the fruit quality to be free of disease as well, coming through a fairly northerly latitude climate and short-ish growing season.
And that's really what defines Oregon differently from Washington, is that in Washington, most of the growing regions are on the eastern side of the Cascades. So we actually have two rain shadow effects there with first the Olympic Range, which is a very high but short range on the Olympic Peninsula, allowing a lot of that moisture to come around. Then it hits this massive long and high range of the Cascades, and all of that moisture, most of the moisture is deposited kind of on the Seattle area. That's why it has this reputation for being super rainy. And while it is at times, it's also what we tell you so we won't move there because we have enough people already. But it totally differentiates the growing region because on the other side of the Cascades, after this major rain shadow impact, it's arid high desert, okay? So that is the big difference in identity between Washington and Oregon, where here, minor rain shadow here with the coastal range, but a lot of opportunity for weather to come in through those gaps and through that vacuum action of the inland heating up and pulling all that air in. Also, it's important to note that there are some AVAs that are shared with Washington as well, most notably the Columbia Valley AVA, which is loosely based on the basalt footprints of recent 15 million years ago, the clash of plates that caused a lot of volcanic action in this area. So within that, you have Columbia Gorge AVA, which is super, super exciting and something to keep your eye on. Talk about diversity. When you're in the gorge, if you're in the western portion, you're higher in elevation, the moisture is much more present, and as you head east, elevation lowers, temperatures rise, and it becomes much more arid, much more like eastern Washington, so kind of cool. And then, of course, all these great appellations down in the south, which we're not tasting today, but you should definitely be aware of, that are really cool for Rhone varieties, Grenache, Syrah, also Tempranillo from Spain, et cetera. So as you get further south, there's a bigger diversity, or maybe just different identity of varieties.
Yeah, as you move south into the Southern Oregon AVA, which houses the Umpqua and Rogue Valley and Applegate Valley AVAs, you're still buffered by mountain ranges, and the rivers become more important for creating airflow here. The aspects of vineyards are much steeper, so you find the vineyards are planted on benchlands, and they're also, even on benchland plantings, they're at 2,000 feet elevation. So a very different shift and very high diurnal range. So in the north, we have a large diurnal range, about 20 degrees in Celsius. What's that in Fahrenheit? Yeah. So we really shift between, we can drop down to the mid 50s from from the mid 90s in the Willamette Valley in the north, and then it's even more severe in the south as well. So really preserving those acids and causing slightly thicker skins and again, keeping the integrity of the grapes. We're going to go on a quick Google tour just so you can feel comfortable with where we are in this.
Who's been to the West Coast? Okay. Who's been to the Willamette Valley? Okay. Only about a third of you. Interesting. All right. Time to plan a trip.
So we are in Oregon. As you can see how arid that central area is, and where all of our growing regions are located is really within these very densely forested areas. We brought some of the forest with us upstairs today, so you can get that feeling of how much the forest impacts our regions and the airflow and the shading and everything that goes on there. So Willamette Valley is what we're going to focus in on. I'm stuck. Angela. So the Willamette Valley in the north, established in the early 80s. Portland is the largest town in proximity, and Salem is our capital, but we do spread all the way down to Eugene. You can see how close that ocean influence is there also. And then you can see also the agricultural influence that's happening in the valley there. There's a lot of cleared land. We have a lot of different agricultural products that go on in this area. And these are the major northern AVAs, which you're going to be tasting in your glass today.
And what's really exciting is we're getting to a point now where you can start to taste typicity in the glass for a number of these Sub-AVAs, which is exciting. Based a lot on their soil, but also their position within the valley and the influences of mainly wind for the most part, in addition to that soil. So we're going to start with the OG area, which is the Dundee Hills. So this is the area that was smack dab in the middle of that northern section. This is where David Lett planted the original vines, Vitis vinifera vines of Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris in the 60s. And it's all based on this kind of little mound here, and is dominated by a basalt soil, meaning an igneous soil that has a lot of iron oxide in it, so we call that Jory. And it has a very bright, rust-colored look to it. It's very, very distinct. And for me, it causes a lot of typicity in wines in terms of having this kind of sanguine, almost bloody type characteristic, and also can come off as salty. And to me is a hallmark of Dundee. Also, it's quite protected by the Chehalem Mountains to the north. So you're protected from those cooling winds coming from further south and or down the Columbia River, and all those are blocked by Chehalem here, as you see. So Dundee is like right around here. To the south, Chehalem Mountains to the north. So this is really interesting and large AVA. It doesn't have a ton planted, only about 1,100 acres, something like that, while the whole AVA is 75,000, somewhere around there. And it's kind of based on two peaks. So you have Parrot Mountain here and Bald Peak further to the north and west. And the soils here vary quite a bit, although there's a huge deposit of loess here, Loess, which is simply degraded basalt. That's a very, very fine soil type. It's well drained, it's low in nutrients. If you ever walked in a vineyard with loess, it gets all over you and you can't get rid of it. You drive your car through a loess vineyard, can't get rid of it. But it's really well drained, low in nutrients, great for high quality grape growing. So there's a lot of that deposited. There's also a band of basalt as well, and also some marine sedimentary soils, okay? Which brings us more specifically to the Ribbon Ridge AVA, which is nested within Chehalem Mountains. And this was separately delineated because it is primarily, almost exclusively, marine sedimentary soil. So not quite as diverse soil-wise as Chehalem, and so therefore was made its own AVA.
And those sedimentary Willamette soil series soils really do produce wines that are very distinctive. And for me, from a blind tasting perspective, I can generally pinpoint Ribbon Ridge, Dundee Hills, Eneola Amity, AVA, Pinot Noirs for the distinctiveness that comes through that soil series. So the Jory, reasonably deep volcanic soils in the Dundee Hills give again that sanguine but brighter fruit flavors, very spiced and quite perfumed, that typical volcanic soil perfume that you see. And then the sedimentary soil series gives almost a ruby red grapefruit kind of character to the wines, very free draining, low in nutrients, and this is quite a buffered AVA as well. And then moving into from Ribbon Ridge, we move towards further west is the Yamhill Carlton AVA. Again, this is a mixed AVA, but primarily sedimentary soils with volcanic pockets. When the tectonic plates shifted and the volcanics eruptions happened, those shifts really sort of created a concertina effect. So you get these marine uplifts. This was all an ocean prior to the volcanic activity 15 million years ago. And so those ocean marine sediment uplifts are really sort of crumbled back against the volcanics in this concertina effect throughout the Willamette Valley. And so the Yamhill Carlton AVA is the closest to the coast and the coast range. So it gets a lot of evening coast range influence in terms of the flow of the air that comes traveling down through these valleys here, but it's also very warm. You can see it's almost an amphitheater. It's this horseshoe-shaped, very protected. The Pinot Noirs from here can be very, dense, purple, dark fruited, very fleshy, very lush wines coming from this AVA. And very approachable in their youth. Much more approachable than some of the other AVAs in their youth. So.
And to speak to the kind of curious shape of that AVA, which is based on two towns, Yamhill and Carlton, which are hamlets, really. I mean, one of them is like a four-way stop. And those are actually down outside the delineated AVA, kind of more on the valley floor. And it's important to note that all of these sub-AVAs start at about 200 feet in elevation, okay? So that's partly why it had a curious shape, because it's following that horseshoe kind of shape of the coastal range and the offshoots of that there.
And then we moved southwest again into the McMinnville AVA. Again, this AVA, the southern aspect of it, gets buffered by the winds coming through the Duzer Corridor, which is our newest AVA. But the McMinnville AVA is predominantly volcanic soils. Very thin topsoil here, though, so the volcanics are really present, and they create a more structured, savory, umami style of salty wine compared to the Dundee Hills, which can be a little more generous and silky in their profile. McMinnville you need to have a great winemaker who's making your fruit from McMinnville, because you can over-extract these wines really easily, and they can just be beasts for about 10 years and near inapproachable. So winemakers are key in McMinnville, and I find some of the most exciting wines coming out of McMinnville, but it's with winemakers who really know their site, and have worked with this fruit for a long time and are prepared to do, hands off and really respect the fruit from the vineyard. So very exciting AVA for me. It's barely planted, and so there's a lot of future potential coming through here just for how diverse and interesting it is. Again, really long-lived Pinot Noir and Chardonnay coming through here from that volcanic influence and also the influence of the Duzer Corridor.
So to give you a little perspective, the Duzer Corridor is to the south here, okay? So what that is essentially a break in the coastal range that creates that funnel action of the inland area heating up and drawing a lot of cooler weather in the afternoons. Also, on the flip side, it can pull warm air from inland outwards as well. It kind of depends on the season and what's happening. So the area just due east of that is the Duzer Corridor, which was just granted in January of this year, 2019. And it was a long process. It took them about 7 years to get the AVA approved, partly because the TTB is the TTB and moves at a glacial pace. But they had also were gathering a lot of info and presented a lot of data in terms of climate and the wind influence in particular. So that was really, really key in defining this. And as the view now turns westward, you can really see the break in the coastal range that allows for that air to go back and forth. So this has a really big effect on the growing season here, where actually in the off season, it's bringing more moderate air in. So you actually get bud break that's about a week earlier than the rest of the sub-AVAs. And also because you have that cooling wind during the hottest part of the year, it cools things off and extends the ripening period about a week or more during the end of the growing season. So you actually have this is the longest growing season in all of the Willamette Valley, which is pretty cool for developing phenolic density and maintaining acids and all that kind of good stuff that makes great wine. So you see here that it's defined by a couple roads, obviously, from these straighter lines, but it is in direct influence and blast zone of that Duzer Gap, and it's mainly marine sedimentary for the most part.
And it's a lower elevation AVA in relation to the other northern Willamette AVAs. So those winds really do rush over. It's almost like a speed bump for the Duzer winds, and the Eola Amity Hills still get the influence of the winds, and they sort of push the wind influence up into the southern part of the McMinnville AVA then. And just while we're on this slide, the first wine in your glass, the Lingua Franca Bunker Hill Chardonnay, is actually from a vineyard just right in here in the South Salem Hills. And so it's a west-facing, vineyard that's set right in the direct hit of the Duzer Corridor as well. So keep that in mind when we're about to start tasting those wines, which will be very soon, I promise.
So as you head east from the Duzer Corridor, we have a longer established other sub-AVA, which is the Eola Amity Hills, which follows this ridge line here. And this is mainly volcanic soil types, although there are deposits of marine sedimentary. But for the most part, it's darker versions of those igneous soil types. So basalt, which is called generally Nakaya, which has a darker color than Jory would have, and has a kind of smoky, earthy effect on the wines, in addition to the influence of the impact of the wind, which will create smaller clusters, generally thicker skins, and therefore change your skin to must ratio, and you have pretty burly, powerful wines along with this smoky type minerality, okay, which for me is a definite typical marker and presents itself regardless of producer, as long as the fruit's being sourced from here. Yeah,
and another AVA, the wines tend to be, slightly less approachable in their use and will reward cellaring.
So this is the overall AVA picture. Remember, Portland's just right up there, just north and east of Chehalem Mountain AVA. So it's really, really close, which makes the whole area very accessible for visitors from Portland.
Okay, some of the other aspects that really influence our growing seasons, temperature and precipitation. As you can see from this slide, we do get fairly warm temperatures during the growing season in the Willamette Valley. They do buffer into the 100-degree zone for a couple of days here and there, but generally we sit around, the 90-degree, early 90-degree mark for many of the weeks during the summer season, and good lows overnight as well. So you can see that shift, which is really the diurnal influence happening there. So again, that cooling influence from the coast is really important. And the other major thing here that's really important is the lack of rainfall. So we have very little rainfall from roughly June until September. And when the rains come in October, they really end our season. So we need to be switched on in the vineyard for keeping track of where these storm systems are in the Pacific and when they're going to hit. We also need really rely on all of that rainfall in the winter months. And when we don't get good winter rainfall or snow caps, that's when our vineyards, which are primarily dry grown, meaning they don't have irrigation, so our soils really need to try to retain as much of that water as they can. We have very few vineyards that have pond systems or access to water or are set up for irrigation. So in the beginning, when you're planting vines, we will hand water, but from then on, the vines are on their own. So we have really deep root systems, and dry grown is a very big factor in our production. This gives you an idea of the day length. We're very similar. McMinnville and Bone, very similar. And Sonoma is a little lower in how long the days are. So we get an average additional growing season of about 10 days in the northern Willamette Valley. And that UV exposure is really important for anthocyanin development and color development in our wines. So our wines are going to be darker in hue than wines from Burgundy and probably from Sonoma as well, depending on the extraction rates. This also means that in the winery, we don't need to overhandle our wines. So we're a fairly minimal intervention region in terms of where our natural anthocyanins and tannin developments come from in the wines.
So, as are a lot of wine-growing regions, this is along the Ring of Fire, which is essentially fault lines that surround the Pacific Ocean. And you'll see all of the growing regions, both in North and South America, are pretty heavily influenced by this. So this is what really has led to the development of a lot of our soils that Bree already touched on a little bit before, where we had a collision of plates. The Juan de Fuca plate, which is under the Pacific Ocean, collided with the North American plate, created a lot of volcanic activity, and one of those plates subducted. So the Juan de Fuca plate subducted, North American plate rised above, and in doing so, raised a lot of area that was covered covered by the sea. That's where we get our marine sedimentary soils from. And then because of that collision and all the volcanic activity, that's where we get a lot of the basalt soils from, okay? So those are represented, advance please.
Sorry.
That's okay. Here, so we've got our basalts and sedimentary from that collision. Also, we have loess, which is degraded basalt, so that's just erosion over the years, and this becomes such a light soil that it's a wind-blown soil, so the wind picks it up and deposits it, almost like snowbanks. It works the same way, and in certain areas, depending on the way the winds go, you can find loess deposits that are crazy, crazy deep. It's pretty interesting. A last one that we should add to this is Missoula flood material as well, which is a series of flood events that happened in North America about 15,000 years ago, where essentially a glacier was melting and that meltwater built up and built up and built up. It got to the point of actually floating the glacier up and released all this meltwater at a crazy, unconceivable rate. It was essentially like a land-borne tsunami, okay? And think of a wall of water, it's 100 plus feet tall, traveling like 60, 70, 80 miles an hour, and just cruising across the landscape towards the Pacific Ocean. And in doing so, picked up a lot of the material, dragged it along, carved a lot of the landscape, and moved various soil material from up by Canada all the way down to the Willamette Valley and beyond. Now, in the Willamette Valley, here it was less impactful because at this stage it lost some momentum and it's getting closer to the Pacific Ocean. So it was more impactful in the north, especially in Washington and whatnot, but you'll find soil material from Canada that's been proven that was moved from Canada down to the Willamette Valley, and I'm talking not little soil types, I'm talking like chunks of granite that are the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, okay? So that gives you an idea of the total force of that. And we don't see that in a lot of the sub-AVAs because we're at an elevation high enough where the Missoula floods didn't have an impact. But in lower parts, we will see some of that Missoula flood impact as well.
Yeah, there's a sort of bathtub ring, if you will, in the Willamette Valley of the Missoula flood soils from the rising and falling of those floodlands, and that's why the elevation for the nested AVAs is generally above 200 feet, because that's where the floodline didn't really impact, and so we don't have those, Missoula flood soils at those higher elevations.
If you're in Washington, Montana, Idaho, et cetera, you can actually see the striations in the soil of those various flood events. So there was, I think, 28, 29 different events as that glacier melted and deteriorated. And so you can actually go and see all of those events, not all of them, but a number of those events, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a beautiful country.
And one thing to note about the sedimentary soils as well, just go back again real quick, sorry, is a quick tangent, is you see they're definitely lighter in color, but these aren't calcium-rich soils, okay? When we hear marine sedimentary, we think of like, champagne, chalk, we think of Burgundy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is not that kind of marine sedimentary. They didn't have those kind of organisms, or for whatever reason they weren't deposited, or maybe the levels at which the sedimentary soil was deposited, they didn't have any calcium-rich things in them, okay? So this is not a calcium-rich soil. It's not Burgundy. Okay, it's not. Willamette Valley in the past has tended to compare itself to Burgundy. It only has the latitude and a couple of varieties in common. Everything else is different, okay? Now they're standing on their own. Obviously the region has proven itself. It doesn't need to compare itself to Burgundy, okay? Willamette Valley is Willamette Valley.
And this is how the soils play out in the AVAs. So you can see that the loess really is being wind-blown from the Columbia Gorge onto those northern slopes of the Chehalem Mountains, and then the rest of the soils are the marine sediments and the volcanic primarily. So you can really get a sense of soil impact through the wines in the glass when you have estate bottled wines or AVA bottled wines, because they are very distinctive.
And so we've seen Van Duzer being the most recent sub-AVA, but there will be others. And there's talk, especially in Chehalem Mountains, of further delineating specific sub-AVAs within that, because as you see, it's pretty diverse of soil types, right? So in the future, there's probably going to be one called Laurelwood, which is their local term for loess. That'll be loess-based, and there will be others, et cetera. But it really, this is key in starting to understand the typicity of the various subregions. It all starts with the soil.
Another interesting fun factoid for Oregon is that in the 70s we had Bill 100, which is a landmark legislation for agriculture protection. So you cannot have urban sprawl out into the Willamette Valley. This was very important to Governor McCall, and the Willamette Valley producers that were in the valley at that time were some of them who petitioned for protection of our agricultural zones. And when you come into the Willamette Valley or any AVA in Oregon, you really do get a sense that this is an agricultural state. We are reliant on a number of agricultural products to build the wealth of our state, and that is everything from logging to farming Christmas trees to berries, clover. We're the largest grower of grass seed in the world. We are second to Turkey in hazelnuts. So we do have a very large agricultural background, and we care about our communities and the workers that come into those communities. And for that reason, we do have a lot of crossover in terms of who works in our vineyards. So they'll often be, pruning blueberries or blackberries 1 month and then moving into the vineyard and then harvesting those berries and then moving into vines. So we really are a community that comes together over our shared interest in small production of high quality agriculture. And so 84% individual ownership, so very small number of corporate companies in the Willamette Valley and in Oregon in general. And generally most of our parcels in agriculture are less than 50 acres. And the average parcel size in Oregon for a producer is around 20 acres. So we are getting larger operations happening, but more than 80% of our growers are less than 5,000 cases in production. So we're a very small grower-maker region, which makes us completely different to California and Washington, where Washington's minimum parcel size is 160 acres for a grower of vines. So there are growers and producers in Washington and California that are bigger than the entire state of Oregon's production. Just gonna let that sit for a second.
Yeah, so something like Chateau Ste. Michelle, much bigger than all of Oregon's production, right? Pretty crazy, think about.
Overall, again, we mentioned that Pinot Noir is king. It's king in the entirety of the state. So we do grow it in the Columbia Gorge, we grow it in the Umpqua Valley, and we grow it in Southern Oregon. And again, followed by Pinot Gris, the aromatic varieties of the cooler climates, and then Chardonnay. Chardonnay's increasing, but we also have all of these other, more warm climate varieties that were planted and are continuing to be planted as our other AVAs expand.
And as climate change takes effect.
And as climate change takes effect.
Yeah. So varietal declaration is a little bit different than in other states. So there's a higher minimum when it comes to varietal. So it's 90% that's required of the name variety versus, say, in California, it would only be 75%. And this is really to preserve the identity of Willamette Valley and Pinot Noir and hold it to a higher standard. But it also applies to Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of how the labels work, it's pretty straightforward in terms of, it works the same way in California, et cetera. So you can have wines just from Oregon, so 100% of the fruit is from Oregon. You can claim an AVA where 95% must be from that named AVA, and then nested within that, again, 95%. And then estate and vineyard designate will always be 100%.
So you must make wine in Oregon. You must be a grower maker in Oregon if you want to have a named AVA on the label other than Oregon. So that's different than other states as well. And remember that these are self-instituted on our state. The producers are confident that the integrity of the grape variety must be kept intact, and also the integrity of the place and trueness of place, and the commitment to their consumers can be very transparent. Transparency is key in Oregon, and so that's why we have such stringent expectations placed on our labeling and on our varietal labeling as well. And again, 47% certified sustainable, and we have 35% of the Demeter biodynamic vineyard certification in the US. So that's reasonably large for for a region that's 1% of.
Yeah, that's the thing here. Is like, okay, you read 40%, it's sustainable. Okay, cool. That's great. It's progressive. Awesome. But this is a number that really blows me away. Because they only produce 1% of all wine produced in the US, and they compose 35% of Demeter certified, that is really, really significant considering the overall production of the US. Okay. There's also a lot of B Corp businesses here. And B Corp is essentially, if you're not too familiar, do a little research because it's really fascinating. It's not only the impact on the environment, but also on your community. And there's a lot of parameters that score that, and is quite difficult to achieve. So to have 5 of the 14 total certified wineries as B Corp be in Oregon is pretty remarkable as well, and shows the progressive nature of the Oregon wine industry.
And finally, there is growing consumer demand despite our high price points. So average bottle price compared to Washington and California is almost double. So $16 a bottle is our average price point. Naturally, that comes from being small grower makers who are very hands-on and small production. However, the retail volume percentage growth is increasing, and we're the only state that's not declining in consumer demand. So as trends for premium wine and fine wine continue, consumers are willing to spend that little bit more for a bottle of wine that they know has environmental integrity, environmental stewardship, and social integrity as well. And perhaps that trend for people drinking less but drinking higher quality is where Oregon is beginning to fit into the consumer marketplace. Obviously, we have a small amount of visibility in the marketplace, but as I said, there's a large area to plant, and those numbers are increasing. So keep that in mind as you're looking at wine lists and retail shelf space.
Yeah, and it also speaks to the hands-on quality of a lot of these wines. As you saw with a lot of the growers also being producers, most of the producers have total control from vineyard to finished wine in the bottle. So as an average quality overall, the bar is set super, super high, okay, compared to other regions where you have, say, these massive plantings that are just selling fruit to whoever and making, more commercial style of wine. There's a lot less commercial style of wine being produced here. It exists, but for the most part, it's more hands-on, and I hate to use this word artisanal because it's way overused, but grower-producer type mentality.
And federal TTB labeling standards, when you can blend 25% of other grape varieties in with the variety that's listed on the label, that allows you a lot of wiggle room in terms of economics. We don't have that.
Oh, God, sorry. Excuse me. Moving on, we don't need to dwell on that. Okay, so we're gonna dive into Chardonnay. And this is a variety that is gaining a lot of ground, making a lot of waves. The quality has just shot through the roof in the last 5+ years. I mean, before that, you hear Oregon Chardonnay, you're like, yeah, I've had a couple, they're okay. Now you're like, oh yeah, I want to pour that by the glass. I had this producer, it was freaking amazing. There's a lot of French winemaking influence overall in the valley with like Dominique Lafon and some others that have made a really big impact on the quality of Chardonnay, in addition to getting in the right clones with the efforts of David Adelsheim in the 80s, among others, getting in some cooler climate varieties that were more appropriate, or clones, excuse me, that were more appropriate for the climate here, because prior to that, a lot of the material was coming up from California, and it was accustomed to a much different climate, generally warmer climate. So it was harder to get those varieties ripe, and as a result, you're ending up with phenolically sparse and really austere styles of Chardonnay. Now, with advancements in viticulture, climate change, etc., those varieties are becoming more viable. Those old kind of heirloom varieties from California are more viable, in addition to their vine age as well. So right now, it's kind of an interesting mix of honoring those old heirloom varieties and old material from California that are definitely creating some delicious wines, but also utilizing the cooler climate Dijon clones as well, which are more appropriate for the cooler parts of the Willamette Valley. So it all depends on where you are in terms of how much wind influence, say, you have from Van Duzer, or how much protection you have. That also plays a big, big role into it.
Let's taste those Chardonnays now. So have a quick nose through and start tasting, and we'll have a chat about the wines in just a second.
So the question was, why does Oregon have a really high percentage of Demeter certified, even though it's a relatively wet region? Because the number one enemy of viticulture is moisture management, right? You have to manage the moisture so you don't have rot. Now, you have to manage that through canopy trimming management. You have to, sort of sprays come in a lot of times that disqualify you from a lot of those Demeter certifications and guidelines. But the key here is that one graph we showed you with how the rain falls, in that during the growing season, it is really quite dry, in addition to those wind influences, whether it be coming through the Van Duzer or is more of a drying wind coming up from kind of the northeast. That really, if you do have a rain event, it's pretty easy to dry out that fruit and to prevent rot naturally without the addition of sprays that would disqualify you from that, would be my...
Yeah, I mean, the dryness of the growing season, so essentially from June to September, we receive very minimal, if any, rainfall. So completely sparse and dry. That's not to say that we don't struggle with powdery mildew, and we need to be on top of that. And however, being small producers, our small acreage, where most of our producers are grower makers or have very close relationships with their farmers, their growers, they're walking the vineyards regularly. They're on top of sprays for biodynamic preparations, but they're in the vineyard. You're not, one of the major differences that I've heard from, recently from a grower dealing with California producers is that I don't talk to the winemaker. I want to deal with, the Willamette Valley, because they're down here walking the vineyards with me at least, once a week when you're coming close to harvest. And before that, they're checking in constantly. So there's this very direct connection with the grower. And that also, I think, comes through in our, social stewardship as well. We don't want to be spraying chemicals and things in the vineyard that are going to harm the people who are working in them, because they're our neighbors or our children. Most of our producers live on the vineyards, so they're working, their kids are out there, their kids are working in the vineyards. We are very small, hands-on farmers, and even as we grow, even us Jackson family, they have direct relationships with their winemakers. Despite coming for a more, you deal with our grower relations manager, not our winemaker, in terms of fruit production and purchasing. So we're very connected. We are incredibly different to the two states either side of us, and that really contributes to why we have such high environmental standards.
I would say there's a lot of support from the local restaurants, both in the Valley and also in Portland, and honestly in Seattle too, where I live. We have almost every restaurant has a Willamette Pinot on by the glass at some stage, or Pinot Gris or Chardonnay at this stage. So I don't have that stat for you. Maybe Bree does, but not a lot is produced. A fair amount of that wine is consumed locally.
Again, we're a well-kept secret because, we're relatively small producers for the last 10 years. Our production has almost tripled in that time. And so now we're starting to see distribution out of state because we have that wine to be able to distribute out of state. Plus, people are traveling a lot more, so they're now coming to the Willamette Valley, purchasing wine there or becoming wine club members, and then traveling back to, where they're from. They've sort of moved on. The highly engaged consumer has moved on from Napa Valley and Sonoma, and are now moving into the Willamette Valley. So you're starting to see a lot more Willamette Valley presence in the national and international marketplace. You really can't produce a bottle of wine in Oregon for less than $30 retail. So when you're competing with Pinot Grigio and Pinot Gris from Europe and Italy and Chile, that's not something that is continually economical when you're getting roughly 3 tons to an acre. they triple our production. So we are a very small production, and we're very hands-on, and so it's just not economically viable. I think what we're starting to find is that with greater clonal selection and more attention paid to site and getting to know the valley more, that growers and winemakers are excited about Chardonnay because they can get maybe a little bit more fruit off of Chardonnay, not a whole lot more, but they can move into parts of their vineyard and parts of the AVA that haven't been explored yet, that can be higher elevation because of the quality of the clonal selection that we now have. And so that's really where we're starting to see some excitement as well.
And also Dominique Lafont is involved in this project as well. So Dominique Lafont is from Merceau and is a part investor in Lingua Franca, has worked in the Willamette Valley for quite a long time at this stage. She was working with Evening Land prior to this and has a lot of experience in the valley and has a very specific imprint. You know, Chardonnay is really a neutral variety in a lot of ways, which is part of its beauty. It really broadcasts its sense of place and or winemaking style. And Dominique Lafont and Thomas Sauve have a very particular winemaking style, which, as you can smell, is quite reductive. And there's some really nice oak on this and a larger format style. And there's a kind of a tautness to this, right? But without being lean. And it's a very particular kind of en vogue style, this reductive style, which we don't have time to get into today what that actually means, but it's that taut kind of Coche, Dominique Lafont style, right? That Pierre-Yves Colomboret style, right? For those of you that drink Burgundy. So.
And you know, the vineyard does play a role in this wine. This is 100% from Bunker Hill in the South Salem Hills, which is west facing, so gets the direct brunt of the Duzer Corridor, which means that its flowering is interspersed. It has small clusters and small berries. So you get what Thomas loves about this site, which was actually sold to a Burgundian from Beaune. They love the phenolic character that comes through from this site, and it adds tension and acidity and structure to these wines. And it also allows, because of that Duzer Corridor influence, the grapes rarely suffer from any type of powdery mildew, unless you're not paying attention in the vineyard and leaf plucking and exposing the fruit a little bit more. But the thick skins, the low juice to skin ratio combines to give that structure and tautness and leanness on the palate. And this wine is not picked early. They pick this wine at 22 bricks or 21 and a half bricks. So it's not an early picked style of Chardonnay. It's single clone 76 and it's mostly own rooted. So it's a very unique site which contributes to the structure of this wine. And then the wine is very gently pressed until the very end, and then they really press out all of the phenolics, and everything goes dirty to barrel, so they don't settle overnight, and they 100% ferment in French barriques. And then once natural indigenous fermentation has taken place, including full malolactic, this has gone through full malolactic, they then rack the wine into a large stainless steel vessel, and it stays on its gross lees for another 6 months. So it gets about 8 months in barrel and then 6 months on the lees to really build that palate texture, along with balancing out some of those phenolics in the wine. And for me, yes, it does have a very distinctive French style.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key factors with this wine is not only the winemaking, but also the material, right? So it's this Dijon cooler climate clone in that site is really, really key. If you were to have some of the heirloom clone material there, it wouldn't be as successful because you just couldn't get it as ripe. So that, along with a lot of gross lees being in with the wine, creating this kind of reductive style, because lees absorb oxygen, right? Even though it's being made in barrel, which is an oxidative environment, you still have fermentation going on, and you have a lot of lees soaking up a lot of that oxygen. So that's really what, to me, defines that wine.
And then goes into 6 months in stainless steel on full lees as well. Yeah. So again, that really structured lees coming through on the palate there. The wine is, Polini-esque. It's lovely.
All right, moving on.
Moving on. Any other questions? The second wine, Britain Vineyards from McMinnville AVA. So this is Britain's actually first fruit coming from their own site in McMinnville, but there is also a lot of Highland Estate, which is a biodynamic vineyard in McMinnville, which is a larger site, and has a mixture of Wente clone and Dijon selection. So this is a crossover selection of Dijon and Wente fruit, and very structured, again, mineral soils, thinner topsoil, and a different style, a slightly more opulent style, not as influenced by the Duzer Corridor and its winds, and a slightly fleshier, opulent style.
And Robert is here today. He actually ducked his head in earlier, so if you have any technical questions about this wine, he'd be a good person to talk to.
Oh my goodness, and if you have an hour to spare. He is a wealth of knowledge and fascinating. Just make sure you got some time. He's amazing. Do head up there to see Britain. And then finally, the 2017 Walter Scott Ex Novo. So this vineyard is in the Eola Amity Hills. It was planted just over a decade ago by Craig Williams, who knows that name in this room? Okay, Joseph Phelps. He planted the Joseph Phelps Sonoma Coast vineyard with all of those amazing mixed clonal selections, which really define the Phelps Sonoma Coast estate, with not only mixed clonal selections of Pinot Noir, but also Chardonnay. So Craig Williams brought into Oregon some of the most diverse selections of heirloom California clones, as well as interplanting. So these are not planted row by row. They're Massal selection plantings of Dijon and California heritage clones all wrapped in together. 15 different clones of Chardonnay go into this wine, and it's very similarly handled in the cellar as the previous wine before that,
the Lingua Franca. Yeah, because the winemaker is Ken, and he and his wife own the winery. Ken makes the wine. Erica manages the winery. And Ken worked with Dominique Lafon at Eveningland. He also worked at Bethel Heights and has been working in the Eola Amity Hills for a long time. So this is raised in a lot of punchin, kind of dummy punchins that are new, along with some neutral oak as well, and is made in a very, very similar style to the Lingua Franca.
The one thing that I see on the palate here that maybe the depth of the, doesn't quite match the intensity and depth on the palate as the Lingua Franca, and I think that's due to vine age. These vines are not that old compared to the 30-something-year-old vines at Lingua Franca at Bunker Hill, and so I think that's the other exciting factor that's also coming into play with Chardonnay in Oregon, is that vine age is an important factor for wines, especially when you have a dry-grown region. You need those vines to go deep into the ground to access the nutrients and the mineral components in that soil. And once they hit that deep levels, then you can get some really exciting, really structured, compelling wines being made. And I think that's what we're starting to see in Chardonnay.
Also, the soil here is fairly different, too, because it's more kind of Jory.
Nicaea.
Jory/Nicaea. There's some Jory in there, though, if I remember right.
There's some Jory. There's also some sediment, marine sediment.
Okay, depends where we are. Okay, right on.
Yeah. Yes, Mary.
You also have a vintage difference in the Lingua Franca and the Scotch.
Yeah.
Is that playing out and
Yeah, definitely. I think fleshiness in bottle is definitely put on, and acidity softened. I mean, this still has that very grapefruit-driven.
Grapefruit pith, kind of like very taut, very linear, whereas I feel the other is a bit more generous, and that's partly due to vintage, partly due to bottle range.
The Lingua Franca.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also this is going to play out in terms of vine age. So young vines that are unirrigated are being affected more by that lack of, the drought effect that's been starting to happen with our series of warm vintages. So we've had warm vintages from 13 onwards, and in 17 was definitely one of our driest years on records. and also one of our hottest as well. So driest, hottest, younger vines are going to suffer a little bit more in that heat stress than, say, vines that are 35 years old. Any other questions about Chardonnay before he's chomping at the bit to move on to... He dropped the F-bomb when he was opening this wine this morning, so tasting it. So he's pretty excited. Okay.
Who is that? My goodness.
Gimme Gamay.
So next I have some Gamay for you, which is both a great example of the variety, but also, we will fix that, also a really good example of the region itself. So this is one of the old school Gamays planted by Doug Tennell, who was a foreign correspondent for CBS for a long, long time. He's this big teddy bear of a guy with a really deep, sexy voice. You could talk to him forever. But he, as he was traveling through Europe, fell in love with wine, and in particular Beaujolais. And when he retired, he wanted to retire back in Oregon, which I believe is where he's from. So he bought this house, the brick house, in the late 80s, early 90s, and planted Gamay all the way back in 92. So these vines are quite old, especially for Gamay. Not the oldest in the state. Actually, Evening Land holds that title of the oldest Gamay vines, even though they didn't know it was Gamay until quite a bit later. I think it was Dominique Lafon that was walking through the vineyard there and said, "That's not Pinot Noir. That is Gamay." But Doug is a big advocate of Gamay, and for me, consistently, like one of the best examples coming out of the state, and has shown the potential for the grape in the region, and most notably, especially in these marine sedimentary dominated soils like we have here in Ribbon Ridge, which, as I mentioned before, do not have any calcareous deposits in them. So actually, they're quite acidic, which results in more basic styles of wine, because that's always an inverse relationship. So broader styles of wine, higher pHs, et cetera. And the cool thing about Gamay is that it really retains a lot of acidity, even in an acidic soil. So this is grown exclusively in marine sedimentary, and usually has a pH of around 3.2. Which, if you're a wine nerd or a chemist or whatever, is really freaking low. Like, that is right around the range of Riesling, for instance. So it's really cool for that respect, and also it yields a bit higher while maintaining quality as well. So that's always a good thing from a grower's perspective, because they can actually make more money on Gamay than they can on Pinot, because at the end of the day, these are all businesses, right? You have to remember that. So to me, this really shows Ribbon Ridge and the sedimentary soil type, in that it expresses a lot of grapefruit, blood orange, very citrusy type fruits to it, in addition to high tone kind of red fruits as well.
Yeah, and I think Chris touched on it, that friendliness for the farmer and slightly higher production and higher acidity levels generally makes it sort of a juicy early drinking style that we can also then start to hit more of that BTG price point level, which really gets these wines into people's hands and gets them into the Willamette Valley at an earlier stage in their wine drinking repertoire. And so we're finding that Gamay is really taking off among the younger generation. And
I mean, this wine makes you want to crush the glass, right? Like, I just want to drink this wine, right? It's so good. It's so good.
Is anyone seeing Gamay from Oregon out there in... How many on trade do we have in the room? Okay.
More than that. Come on, shy guys. Really? Okay, yeah, I know you. I know you. You're on trade. Meaning on-premise, meaning
On-premise,
sold in restaurants.
Sorry, restaurant, wine bar. Okay.
Okay, cool.
And the rest, retail? Okay. Yeah, so keep an eye out for Gamay. We don't even have a statistic on it. That's how small an amount is planted, but there's a lot of grafting going on. So you're going to see it coming out. There's roughly 30 producers, and this weekend is actually the I Love Gamay Festival in Portland. So, if you want to have weather like is out there today, nice and sunny, we get that at this time of year in Portland, and there's a fabulous Gamay Festival on. So come join us. and
Yeah,
drink
so like
delicious Gamay.
Evening Land makes a great one. Bow and Arrow, Belpont, who you're going to taste the Pinot from later, makes a great one. There's
Enemy, who are upstairs.
Yeah, there's a significant amount of people that are making really awesome Gamay. So on to Pinot Noir.
So Pinot Noir, the king of grapes in Oregon, 19,000, pushing 20,000 acres planted in the Willamette Valley. 58% of Oregon's production, but much higher in the Willamette Valley. The Willamette Valley is Pinot Noir, essentially, with some diversity coming. But really, vine age, site selection, and again, new clones. We're introducing new heritage clones from other areas that are starting to make Pinot Noir, more interesting and diverse in structure in the Willamette Valley. However, the one thing for me that is very unique to Oregon is that Oregon is based primarily off of 2-3 clones of Pinot Noir. So Wadensville clone, which was introduced to UC Davis by Harry Olmo. If anyone wants to geek out about Harry Olmo with me afterwards, we will do that. He transferred vines all over the world. He's responsible for the Margaret River growing region in its entirety. And he was also responsible for bringing in grape varieties that ripen in northerly latitudes. So Wadensville, obviously Pinot Noir comes from Burgundy, but this was taken by mercenaries to Switzerland in the 17th century, where it has been raised unto itself and is now known as the Wadensville clone. Wadensville and Pommard. Pommard number 2 came up to Oregon with David Lett and Charles Curry in 1963 and was planted in 1965. And those 2 clones are not planted anywhere else with such abundance other than in Oregon, in the US, or the world for that matter. Wadensville is very spicy, high-toned, bright red fruit profile, fairly soft tannins, but much more in that, really lifted, pretty, vibrant style.
Yeah, to me it always has like rose hip type characteristics, and also kind of goes into the realm of what we're speaking about with that Gamay from Brickhouse, with this kind of blood orangey type thing. To me, it reminds me actually a lot of like Norella Mascalese from Sicily, that rose hip, blood orangey type thing, and it's very, very impactful in the wine, the finished wine, and I can almost always identify if there's a heavy dose of Wadensville in the blend. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and then Pommard is almost the frame and the structure of the wine. So you can see these 2 wines fitting, these 2 grape varieties fitting together so succinctly, like hand in glove in a vineyard. And these are what the majority of the plantings up until the mid-90s really were in Oregon. This is the bulk of the Dundee Hills, of the northern Willamette Valley industry, and it's incredibly distinctive and will get you to Oregon every single time. So Curry and Erath brought in different clones from which they thought were Pommard, but they don't actually play out to be anything like Pommard. And so this has become now known as the Curry clone, and that will pop up in the oldest vineyards in Oregon as well. But what you really need to be aware of is that structural earth element of Pommard, and then this lifted perfumed spice element of Wadensville as being distinctively Oregon and to our character.
And one quick tangent on clones. We're kind of geeking out on clones for this stuff, but it is really an important part of the history of the Willamette Valley and really of any region. But one thing I want to impress upon you is that I think more important than clone is time in a place, okay? Meaning that all vines tend to mutate a lot, and actually very quickly in the big picture, right? So the more time the vine spends in a specific place, the more it adapts to that particular climate, soil, etc. And to me, as time goes on, it's mutating into something entirely different than the original material. While the original material is important, time is really the most important factor when it comes to clones. So it's good for the history, understanding where it comes from, but the more age that they see, the more of the place they become, if that makes sense. Okay, so clones are important, but time is even more so.
Yeah, and to that point, Jason Lett at Irie, the son of David Lett, is actually proprietary cloning, grafting, labeling an Irie clone. of Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, and Pinot Noir at UC Davis. So those will be available to Oregon growers in the next few years as well. The Dijon clones were brought in the late 80s, and these, again, really brought in a confidence factor, if you will, in a cool climate region. So the Dijon clones, 114, 115, 667, 777, they tend to ripen earlier, they take on sugar earlier, and so they can be a sure thing in the vineyard. And to a farmer or anyone in agriculture, a sure thing is a good thing. So these clones were picked up. What we're finding now is that with some of the heat that's been happening, these clones are maybe better as a portion of the blend or at higher elevations, and definitely for sparkling production. So we're finding that the Dijon clones are really starting to find their own place in the valley as well, and it's becoming a much more complex and diverse clonal conversation within the northern Willamette Valley for clones. So flight two.
So here we have a vintage that was not well received from the media, although from my tasting experience, it's a vintage I absolutely love. It was one of the coolest on record. It was one of the latest harvests on record. It wasn't uncommon for producers to be harvesting in November. Okay, November. Now you saw that graph of precipitation before. A lot of the rains come in October. So you really had to have the cojones to let your fruit stay on the vine in order to reach phenolic maturity. At the same time, you can imagine, because it was so cool, there's a lot of acid retention, right? And a lot of phenolic development if you are managing the canopy right and if you let it hang long enough. So a lot of people who kind of freaked out and harvested early didn't really make interesting wines, but the ones that let the fruit hang and made some really phenomenal wines that are really long-lived. And it's kind of sad that the good producers had such a hard time selling these wines. I bought a whole slew of these wines for half price or even less because the distributors couldn't get rid of them, unfortunately. And it just really is a vintage that required time and bottle because of its acid drive. But now, as you're tasting in these glasses, they're beautiful wines, right? And what's cool about wine 5 is the Beaufrère is it's another great example of Ribbon Ridge and of that marine sedimentary soil, where you see a lot of the parallels between the Brickhouse Gamay and this wine, even though they're different varieties, different vintage, different producer. I mean, you still see that clear line of that higher tone red fruit with citrusy elements, which I think is really, really awesome to see that typicity in the wines.
And while it was, disappointing at the time for distributors and for producers not to be able to sell these wines, and for the media to be so disappointing and needing more time with wines like this, it is fortuitous for us now, because we know that in vintages like this, that these wines are the wines that really go the distance. This wine is actually I poured the Bethel Heights for Chris this morning, and he was like, that's 2011? That's so fresh. So,
yeah.
So these
wines even look at the
are
color and everything of that wine. Like, you can see the advancement of the Beaufrère a little bit, but that's also just the kind of the nature of that winery and the color of the wine.
Sedimentary soils, less extraction, some whole cluster. Obviously no whole cluster in this year.
Yeah, and actually the Bethel Heights is a good example of Eel Amity Hills, because you're seeing the effects of that wind, smaller berry size, higher ratio of skin to must, right? So you're getting more concentration of color, which you see here, which also lends to its longevity in certain ways as well.
Yeah, and so just for reference, that first wine was 100% Pommard in Wadensville on own-rooted vines, biodynamically farmed. The first one, the Beaufrère. So biodynamically farmed, 100% Wadensville and Pommard, and you really see that perfume and prettiness coming through from the Wadensville. And Mike loves those two clones as well. And even when he planted his new vineyard, Sequitur, he is still sticking with those clones and foregoing the Dijon clones, which he did plant at Beaufrère in the Upper Terrace in those later years. But even with his own vineyard now, he's doing mixed clonal selection of Pommard and Wadensville and California heritage clones. So he's planting Calera and those older heritage clones, heirloom clones coming up from California. The Bethel Heights is 100% 667 on own roots.
So 667 is a Dijon clone. And which wine of the three is most tannic to you? 3. Okay, interesting. All right. For me, it's 2, which I think is really indicative of Eola Hills, again, showing that influence of the wind, soil, etc.
Yeah, and you can see the recoil and reserve on the palate in this Bethel Heights wine. You know, it's still fairly tightly wound. It's got a darker profile. It's got that smoky, dark mineral, almost oolong tea character that is so distinctive and of the Eola Hills. It's, you know, very, very classic Eola Hills wines. And, you know, the fact that these are some of the oldest producers in the Eola Hills as well. Second generation Ben Castile makes these wines, and his cousin Mimi farms there. So these wines are, you know, very of the place and uncannily distinctive of Eola So keep that frame in mind when you're thinking about wind influence and volcanic influence in Eola Hills.
And Mimi also farms for Lingua Franca too, as a little aside. Okay, let's move on to the next flight, unless there's any comments, questions on the 2011 flight. No? Okay. So next we have a slew of 2015s for you. Right? Yeah. 2015s. So the first one is Johan Vineyard. So this is consistently, man, one of my favorite wineries today. So delicious. They make a skin contact Pinot Gris, and I'm not like a big, you know, white skin contact wine kind of guy, but that wine is incredible. It's got like Angostura type elements that are so pretty and lovely, almost like mezcal type elements. Here we're tasting their Pinot Noir. So they're in the Van Duzer Corridor area, so further south, the newest AVA, very, very heavily influenced. Everything is grown biodynamically, and they've been biodynamic for quite a while now. And they've done a lot of work in terms of soil reparation, so which is really cool. So the Van Duzer Corridor is primarily marine sedimentary, and again, it's that more acidic version of marine sedimentary, and so the resulting pH in the wines can be quite challenging, meaning higher pH wines, not quite as stable, and lacking some verb. So they've done a lot of work through biodynamics to create a lot more carbon exchange through the treatments of biodynamics, and therefore change the pH of their soil. And they've done it, they've changed the pH of the soil by more than 1 point, which is really, really significant. And I think is super progressive for the area, where other people are not being as creative and maybe pumping in lime and things like that, which is maybe not the best idea. It's a solution, maybe not the best. So I think that's pretty cool that they're really changing the game in that region in particular, which can be challenging.
This wine also obviously has a fair amount of whole cluster component to it, which is something that we're seeing some of the winemakers embrace in these warmer vintages, where stem lignification is really very common, and powdery mildew pressure is incredibly low. So you're not introducing any of that fungal element to your wine vat, which can be dangerous. So in the warmer vintages, where in warm vintages and in warm regions in general, you tend to get a flattening out of high tone and complexity in wines when that happens. So adding in whole cluster is definitely another way that producers are looking to add in depth and lift and brightness and prettiness to their fruit profiles as well. You see a little bit of that whole cluster also in the previous wine, even though it's a 2011, the Raptor Ridge, which is from a portion of low soils as well. That site is actually a very mixed site. And so you're seeing a little bit of whole cluster in that, even though it was such a cool year. The drainage on those low soils is immense, and they can really get good ripeness. So this Johan is incredibly, perfumed and lifted because of that whole cluster influence, in addition to the Van Duzer Corridor element as well.
Yeah, because you have to remember that whole cluster is not just about stems, right? Whole cluster implies whole clusters, meaning whole berries, which implies carbonic, okay? So carbonic is what's building a lot of perfume in the wines. It's something that we tend to pigeonhole with just Beaujolais, when in fact it's used for Grenache, Syrah, Pinot, all sorts of varieties all over the world. It's simply a winemaking tool, okay? So, No. No Gamay. 100% Pinot Noir.
100% Pinot Noir.
Yeah, 100% Pinot Noir.
Yeah.
So that adds a lot of lift and a lot of perfume through that carbonic, in addition to some more savory elements from the stems, right? Which is pretty cool. And I think it's pretty clearly apparent in that wine. It's a good example of whole cluster if you're not familiar of the effects on a finished wine.
It's also a mixed clone wine with a lot of Wädenswil and Pommard, but also some 943 and Swan and Curie and Mount Eden and Calera heirloom selections that are coming into those, which are also helping to retain some of that acidity as well. When you add whole clusters to a wine, to a ferment, you're going to shift the potassium, and so you're going to increase the pH level and the breadth and density of that wine. But with these additions of the heirloom varieties, they're really retaining the acidity quite naturally as well. So that's an important factor in some of these wines as well. The 2015 Knudsen is reserve from the Dundee Hills, and that is quintessential Dundee Hills in my mind. You know, you get that hint of sanguine element, that sort of, bite your lip, but also this incredibly polished, glossy, almost, a caricature of cherry in your profile in your mouth. Silky, that sort of silky mid palate combined with lift. Again, this vineyard is one of the oldest vineyards in the Dundee Hills. It was planted in 71 and has really been an icon farmed site in this area. It's very high demand in terms of wine club sales and local restaurant, but you tend not to see it so much out of the marketplace.
And it's another good example of Dundee in that it's rich and broad, right? If you remember from the map, and we talked about the protection it receives from the Chehalem Mountains, this area consistently, no matter what the producer, produces very broad, definitely higher in alcohol versions of Pinot Noir, but they all carry it really, really well. So it's actually not unusual to see 14.5% Pinot Noirs coming from here that are beautiful. I know we tend, not so much these days, but in the last few years, I've really focused in on alcohol levels. And granted, varieties like Pinot Noir generally don't carry higher alcohols very well. But I would argue that Dundee actually does carry them extremely well. And even if you look at a very Burgundian influenced style of winemaking, such as Veronique at Durand, those wines are consistently 14.2, 3, 5, and they're beautiful and they age for a really, really long time. So it's really just a characteristic of the region. Along with that, I think the sanguine quality from Jory really helps to balance that out.
Yeah, and again, those dry-grown vineyards where especially on the older sites where you've got vine age combined with Oregon heritage clones of Pommard and Wädenswil in these, deep, Jory volcanic soils where they can really meter out the moisture a little more, and the vine roots can really dig deep to provide complex and balanced wines in these hot vintages. 2015 was not quite as hot as 2014, and by 2015, winemakers had seemed to have got a better handle on how to work with, quite high alcohol, warm climate fruit. 2014, I think a few people were taken by surprise, and I think you see that in the mixed bag of wines that comes out in 2014. By 2015, I feel like Oregon as a region is incredibly collaborative, and everyone is tasting each other's wines in the cellars, and they have a lot of tasting groups. And so I think by 2015, they've really sorted out a lot of those that kind of snuck up on me and at problems. And
which is good because 16 followed, and
16
which is
and
also
17
quite warm. So they're definitely having to adapt to these changes in climate and adapt quickly. And I think there's a really good point that I never really thought about is the jump from 14 to 15 in terms of overall kind of like retention of acidity and balance is massive. If you even look at the same producer, like the shift is pretty apparent.
Yeah, pulling back on extraction, pulling back on, even pressing at not quite dryness, just so that you're not, as that alcohol creeps up, it's not acting as a solvent on the skins and the seeds and even on oak. So we're starting to see a lessening of new oak and also a lessening of extraction in those warmer vintages, just to bring out the trueness of the site and the variety as well. And someone who does that very well is Brian O'Donnell from Belpont. I believe he's upstairs as well, if you want to have a chat to him also. He's been making wine in Yamhill Carlton AVA. So this is one of those AVAs that tends to be broader and fleshier and more approachable in its youth. And Brian definitely really wrangles these wines into a lovely, delicate balance and structured elegance, even in a warm vintage in Yamhill Carlton.
And he has a pretty diverse clonal selection in the vineyard as well, 4+ clones for this wine, so pretty cool. Okay, so next we've got the Futurist, so just a couple of different varieties that you probably wouldn't expect to taste from Willamette Valley. First, starting with Syrah from Christum. So while in times past, it took very special vintage and site in order to get Syrah ripe, that's definitely changing, okay? As we've seen starting with 12, which is quite ripe, 13 not as much, 14 super ripe, 15, 16, 17, etc. It's getting easier and easier to ripen Syrah, and I think there's a bright future for Syrah. And as we mentioned before, we're seeing more and more plantings of Syrah. It's still minuscule in terms of the Willamette Valley, more prominent down in the south. But as time goes on, we're going to see more of it. And man, tasting this wine, it's unquestionably Syrah, and it's kick-ass. I love this wine. This is from 2015, so a broader vintage. They're doing a fair amount of whole cluster, just around 40-ish% for this vintage, and you get a lot of savory qualities. There's still that rotondone type character, that black pepper, spicy note, charcuterie. I mean, if you put this in a lineup of ripe vintage Rhone, I don't think it would be that easy to really parse it separately from the rest, honestly. And it's made by a legend in the valley, so they're in Eola Amity Hills. Steve Dorner's making the wines, and they have kind of they treat this actually in the same way that they treat a lot of their Pinots, which is roughly almost always about 40-ish, 50-ish% whole cluster, along with a fair amount of new oak. There's 30%-ish on this
30%.
wine, if I remember right. Do you get oak on this wine? No, right? It's super well integrated, and that's how all the Pinots are as well. So almost everything they make is estate fruit, and they have very distinct blocks on their sites that will carry a vineyard designate. And for me, this is a super, super exciting snapshot of what Willamette Valley can be in the future.
Yeah, and I love, one of the stories that Steve tells is, he came from Calera, he was making Pinot Noir in cool climate California, and was terrified that he wasn't going to be able to ripen Pinot Noir in the Willamette Valley so far north. So this was a big punt for him. A big risk for him to, move so far north in that time and to commit to Pinot Noir in the Willamette Valley when there were maybe 3 other producers in the Eola Amity Hills at that time. And after his first 2 vintages, he convinced the Gary family to plant Syrah. He was adamant that there was going to be no problem in a few years ripening Syrah in this environment because of what he was seeing in the consistency of Pinot Noir coming through. And this was in the early 90s or late 80s? Early 90s, like 92. So, his commitment to this variety is amazing, and he makes some of the, quintessential styles from this wine as well.
Yeah. And the next wine is from Eola Amity Hills. This is Cabernet Franc, which, I mean, how many Willamette Valley Cabernet Francs have you had? 1, right? But again, shows you that in certain areas, even a Bordelaise grape can get ripe, even though it's a very light on its feet version of Cabernet Franc. It's so perfumed, so ephemeral. It's really, really beautiful. And actually, Bree made this wine, so I'm just going to shut up and let her talk about it. I want to pay my respect because this is something that you wouldn't think would work, right? But it does, and it creates a wine that is a pretty unique expression of Cabernet Franc. This is definitely not, I wouldn't compare this to Right Bank Bordeaux by any means. I wouldn't compare it to the Noir. It's its own thing. To me, it's just very, very perfumed, kind of like a very perfumed and a little bit more weighty version of Pinot Noir almost. Kind of
yeah, absolutely. And so, what no one will tell you is that it wasn't just Pinot Noir that was planted in the Willamette Valley back in the 60s. We had Dick Erath, on Warden Hill Road at Prince's Hill, and, he planted Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Pinot Noir. He planted a gamut of things. Over time, these got replaced by Pinot Noir as Pinot Noir became more known within the valley. But now, along with a ripening climate, can we call it, and expansion into other areas, and also most importantly, good clonal material, there's a lot of opportunity for expanding the varietal conversation in the Willamette Valley. And I had the opportunity to work with this Eola Springs vineyard, which was planted 25 years ago in the Eola Amity Hills. It's primarily Nakaya and pockets of Jory soil. It's west facing, so it gets that nice warm afternoon sun, but it also gets the impact of the Duzer Corridor. And also the people that own this vineyard are Californians, and what they brought up with them was some diversity in clonal material for Cabernet Franc. So they brought clone 2 from California, from Napa, and they also bought a clone called Steiner, which is very unique to a vineyard, John Steiner's vineyard in the Napa Valley, and it actually spread throughout the Napa Valley of that particular clone. So now that clone is here, and this is literally 2 rows, I almost called this wine long row, but for me, it's just, this was a puncheon. I did 1 puncheon whole cluster and 1 puncheon fully destemmed, and this is the destemmed puncheon. The whole cluster just didn't play well. It dominated the conversation, and this really shows the purity of the grape variety and the purity of the site in a cooler climate expression of Cabernet Franc. So very gentle extraction. It's not particularly dark. It was all done by hand, and very easy, elegant, gentle Cabernet Franc. So.
Did the whole cluster one come out to dominated by pyrazine, or no?
It actually wasn't pyrazine. So I leaf plucked. So we worked in the vineyard really closely with the viticulturist, and we fully exposed the fruit. So pyrazines are photodegradable. So they're photosensitive. So if you rip off the leaves and expose the fruit, you get ripeness without the pyrazine quality. And so this extended UV impact resulted in, the longer daylight hours in Eola Amity and in Oregon. It allows us to get the fruit fully ripe without pyrazine character, while also not dehydrating or over-ripening the fruit as well. So that was something that, we were experimenting with. It was essentially a wine trial. And, I wasn't expecting that this wine would be anything, amazing. But when we continued to taste through the cellar, this was one of the wines that we consistently came back to and that people were excited by when we were tasting through the cellar.
So you need that cooling wind in order to counteract the full exposure. If you had full exposure and no cooling wind, it would probably be too much.
We also picked, this was the last grapes that came into the winery as well. So, everything else, all of the other Pinot Noir in this vineyard had been picked 3 weeks before this, and this was still hanging out there, and we were just waiting, and it was just hanging out, getting more and more flavor. So possibly, in certain sites, Cabernet Franc may be something that you'll see more of in the Willamette Valley. I've, just recently seen a Tempranillo vineyard planted in the Dundee Hills.
So with that, we want to impress upon you that Willamette Valley, yes, is great Pinot Noir, absolutely. But it's also super diverse, and what the future holds, I think, is going to be super exciting and shouldn't be only thought of as Pinot Noir only. Excellent Pinot Noir, yes, but also, apparently, excellent Syrah and Cabernet Franc, Gamay, Chardonnay, Riesling, which we didn't even pour for you today, but you can taste them upstairs. There's amazing Riesling that's being produced.
Gruner Veltliner.
Gruner Veltliner. I mean, we could go on and on and on. So it is an extremely diverse region, and the Sub-AVAs, with the influence of these winds and soils, is a really, really key factor in that. So we hope we got that across to you today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
More questions?